Okay, so here on the Monday morning, we have the Athletics football correspondent David Ornstein, as well as our Manchester football writer Mark Critchley, who was also at Old Trafford for that 4-3 win against Liverpool in the FA Cup. It was actually such a goal fest in the FA Cup, but we're going to focus on Manchester United. Critch, Man United got one over their old foes.
Absolutely. I think first thing to say, one of the great FA Cup ties, one of the great Manchester United Liverpool games, just everything really that is good and right about football, in my opinion. Honestly, like speaking on a personal level, even professionally, one of
Yeah.
the best games that I've had the privilege of being at, and made, I think, by two brilliant but really kind of far from perfect teams. And it was almost as though those flaws were part of the appeal. I think certainly in United's case. You wouldn't say that they dominated Liverpool in any respect,
Mm.
but the game was so fast, it was so fluid, it was so direct, it was so intense, full of intensity. And I think, Erik Ten Hag's been faced with a lot of questions this year about what is United's style of play? What is he trying to achieve? Look at that game yesterday, and I think it's that. It is fast, it is direct, it is intense. It's actually not that different from Liverpool's style of play, I don't think, which is not to say that United are in any way nearly as good as Jurgen Klopp's title challengers, obviously. But you can see what he's trying to achieve. You can see the idea there. And although it has huge gaping flaws in it, when it works, right, it's brilliant. What an incredible spectacle it was.
I just want to
Yeah.
pick up on that really quickly. The thought I had coming out of the game was organized chaos, because you had Anthony finishing at left back and Bruno Fernandes in central midfield. And a lot of people have been saying it was a bit of a masterstroke by Erik Ten Hag and his substitutions all worked, all of which is true. And then others have been sort of saying it was all over the place, and somehow they managed to get through, despite it just being a bit of a muddle. But I actually think that the style in which Liverpool have built over the years, and like Critch, I'm not comparing the two clubs by any means. Manchester United have a long way to go to get to where Liverpool are at. But Liverpool's rise under Klopp has been built on that very sort of ethos, in contrast to Manchester City, who are all very calm and meticulous and methodical in their approach. And it's almost like death by a thousand cuts, and everything is planned and precise. Jurgen Klopp has gone heavy metal, a lot of pressure and intensity and positional switches. And actually, Erik Ten Hag took a leaf out of that book yesterday. And when you compare it to many of Man United's performances over the couple of years that he's been in charge, you finally see something that looks like he may have tapped into the qualities of those at his disposal, especially with the injury crisis where he's had to adapt. And it was a really impressive day for Manchester United. And they've kind of set a standard now in terms of big game result, big game performance, players playing for the manager, which many have been questioning, that they'll have to live up to.
Yeah, for sure. A player that, I mean, what a return back into the team. Amad Diallo scores a goal, gets sent off. Brilliant, absolute storyline. But I wonder what this means for him, Critch, because it is a player that could have gone in January. Actually, he chose to stay at Manchester United. Offers we heard came from Italy. Offers came from the Championship. Offers came from various other teams, and he chose to stay at United to fight for his place. What do you think this means for his future?
I think it could be a huge moment. Obviously, look, I think Amad's kind of journey and his story at United it's kind of been coloured by the fact that he came in for a fee potentially rising to £37 million. And when you pay that amount of money for a young player, it was back in October 2020 when they signed him, he joined in 2021. When you pay that amount of money for a young player, you get all the hype that comes with it. And he was arriving at the club with just 4 senior appearances to his name. And I remember that the second half of that season under Solskjaer, and he was getting opportunities. He scored against AC Milan. That was his last goal. Before yesterday, that was his last goal almost, 3 years ago, right? So it's been a very slow process for him to really break into the team and for us to see the player that I think a lot of people believe is there. He's had loans at Rangers. He was obviously at Sunderland last season as well. Especially popular there, won their Young Player of the Year. And I think he came, particularly last summer, came back to United, and not only externally there was an expectation that this was his year to kick on. I think he expected that himself. I remember, just a few yards up the road from me, actually, he was in his spare time. He was training on AstroTurf pitches in Fallowfield in Manchester, just because he wanted to be right and ready for the season, because he felt this was his opportunity to really stake a claim and win a place. And then he had this knee injury in pre-season, and really that has scuppered whatever progress he could have made this season. He came back from that around Christmas. His opportunities over the last few weeks, even though United have had this injury crisis, even though there's been holes to fill in the front line, he hasn't always been getting them. And I think it was interesting yesterday that Ten Hag in his post-match press conference, he referenced that, and he admitted actually that Amad hasn't had the opportunities that he's deserved, that his performances in training and the effort that he's been putting in and the dedication he's shown, that those performances have warranted. So look, I thought, he came on yesterday's introduction. The goal obviously is incredible, and I have to say, I've always wanted it. If I was in that position, if I was going through scoring a last-minute win against Liverpool at the Stretford end, I was on a yellow card, I'd just take my shirt off and run down the tunnel. I wouldn't even stay around for the red card. but look, his performance, the goal obviously, but he starts that goal by winning the ball on the edge of United's penalty area off Harvey Elliott, just as he'd nicked the ball off Darwin Núñez for the equaliser that was like 7 or 8 minutes before in extra time. So it's not just his goal scoring, it's his all-round work rate and his all-round effort, and you're seeing that from a guy who's still just 21 years old and still has a big future, possibly at United, possibly elsewhere, but in the game generally. And I think that performance yesterday and that moment more than anything else can only do wonders for his Old Trafford career.
It was that pressing that led to his yellow card actually initially, and also a couple of other great moments for Manchester United, and it's arguably what they've been missing a lot of the time when you talk about the press or lack of that let Jarrell Quansah get through to put Liverpool ahead in the game. And there was something about Amad's performance and the iconic moment that was almost Makeda-like against Aston Villa that year, and the goal was almost Michael Owen-like against Manchester City in front of the Stretford end. And you never know, these are often like those small instances that lead to much bigger repercussions individually and collectively as well. I think he probably set a standard that others at United should look to follow, a real hunger. That's always going to resonate with the Manchester United fans. It's been a source of a lot of the complaints, and it also shows that Manchester United have some really good young players coming through, and younger than him even, but there's been so much talk, and rightly so, about Liverpool. We recorded a podcast on their youth revolution after the League Cup win. But actually Manchester United started with more products in their first team, and they brought Amad on as well. And for all the criticism that has surrounded Manchester United, Ten Hag, the ownership, the hierarchy, the structure and everything, much of which is completely legitimate, they do have some green shoots of recovery there and some hope that I think INEOS and the new regime will latch onto and say, if we can harness the good parts and maybe start to eradicate some of those bad parts and build properly in the transfer market and behind the scenes, then it's not too long to become competitive. We've seen teams such as Liverpool turn things around relatively quickly, Arsenal too. And that was a day that will live long in the memory for everyone, really. I mean, it's the sort of match that whoever you support or your persuasion or whether you're neutral, it was box office. It was like an amazing day for the FA Cup and weekend, to be fair. And the one thing I didn't get about Amad was why he went straight down the tunnel and into the dressing room. Like, wouldn't you have just taken your red card and been itching to come on for the celebrations? and like there's no images of the man who basically sent United into the FA Cup semi-finals, but he came out for his interviews later and he actually spoke really well. And remarkably, he was fasting for Ramadan. So he must have been sort of quite low on energy, but it didn't seem so as he went through on goal. I actually thought they had perhaps lost the opportunity because Garnacho's pass wasn't perfectly into Amad's stride. And then you got, was it Conor Bradley who came across? And he was having the most amazing time of things himself. But the way Amad managed to beat him and squeeze that shot in against a keeper who has been outstanding since deputising for Alisson just made it the sort of perfect end for United.
Yeah, just very quickly, could Amad's goal prove to be a Mark Robins moment? Mark Robins, obviously the manager of Coventry, but notoriously when playing for Manchester United back in the day, was said to have saved Alex Ferguson's job scoring against Nottingham Forest 1-0. Could this be that moment, Mark?
Look, I think
For Erik Ten Hag?
I don't know how many Mark Robbins moments I've had over the years covering United. There's been a few. I remember Jose towards the end of his reign. There was a game against Newcastle. I think it was in about October, so a couple of months before he actually departed, where Sanchez scored a last-minute winner. They'd be 2-0 down, came back to win 3-2, I think. And, everyone was exactly the same. Look, the parallels are obviously a little bit more obvious here. It's the FA Cup. It's set up a semi-final literally against Mark Robins, and I can see 1,000 preview pieces blooming before that semi-final that will focus on that subject. But look, I think Ten Hag's spoken recently about how he's felt that since the new year the performances have been better. And to be fair, while I think you can debate that, they certainly had that run of wins before a few more injuries set in. Generally, results have picked up. Maybe the performances haven't always been there underneath those results, but the results have picked up since then. But he's been waiting and wanting a turning point. He's called it a turnaround in his preview to this game on Friday. Just a moment to really spark things. And look, if ever a moment could spark something, then it's that one yesterday and that game yesterday. So absolutely. But look, we've still a way to go towards the end of the season. There's still some milestones, really, some kind of achievements that need to be unlocked, if you like, before anybody's going to have any guarantees over his own future or whatever. But look, I think things have been moving in a positive direction generally for a couple of months now, and yeah, absolutely, that moment yesterday was massive.
Yeah, for sure. Well, also, before we move on for more on Manchester United's match winner, there is a brilliant piece by Simon Hughes diving deep into the story of Amad Diallo and the man accused of trafficking him to Europe on The Athletic, with a link to the piece also in the description of today's pod. So make sure you check that out. Really, really fascinating article as well. Right, let's move on and talk about Ten Hag's future. Look, it's a real tough one. Because Manchester United is such a big club. So judging any manager on the job they're doing at such a big club is always going to be really fascinating anyway. But do we think, Mark, that Erik Ten Hag has done enough to convince he deserves more time as a Manchester United manager? Qualified for the Champions League last season. Let's not forget, this is his 4th time, I think, at Wembley. Come on.
It's a pretty good record when you put it like that. But look, I think that's only part of the story. And we've done enough podcasts on this subject or around this subject this season alone to know that it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think, like you say, United's such a huge club that when you are a manager who is perceived to be underachieving at it, you're never more than a few defeats away from more scrutiny and more pressure falling upon your shoulders. Equally, you're never more than a few wins away from that pressure lifting. And I think, again, a result, a moment, a game like yesterday is going to do that. And it's nice that we now go into an international break without that hanging over Ten Hag himself, without that hanging over the club. I think, look, things you're asking, has he done enough to convince? I think it's too early to say that there are really any guarantees over that beyond the end of the season. I think you have to judge it on where will United be at the end of the season. If they win the FA Cup, if they qualify for the Champions League, you could actually put up a pretty strong case that on that record alone, it's actually better than last season, right? I mean, they got Carabao Cup, FA Cup slightly more prestigious, and you're back in the Champions League. And so take it from there. If you don't I think certainly if you don't get Champions League, then there's more pressing questions to ask. And you would struggle to say that United have moved forwards on from last season and progressed. So, look, I don't think any one result can really move the needle decisively in either direction at the moment. It's going to be a much fuller and a much broader analysis probably at the end of the season that makes that decision.
David, I'm going to come to you very quickly about INEOS, but I just want to throw something to Mark. If United do lose against Coventry, who are tricky customers, I watched that game against Wolves, are we going to be sitting here going, is Ten Hag on his way out? I mean, it's that fickle, it's that much in the balance, isn't it?
It's literally the perfect example of what I was just saying. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like if they lose that game, I don't know, like United's worst FA Cup results. I think losing to Leeds at home in 2010. There was like a goalless draw against Exeter, a non-league at the time,
mm,
2005. People with longer memories probably remember worse ones than that. But look, I think it'd be all the worse that it's at a semi-final. It'd almost be all the worse that it'd come after such a delirious elation of
mm,
yesterday, right? Where people thought the season had been salvaged to some respect to have it fall apart by losing a semi-final to, with all due respect, Coventry City. You were brilliant, I
mm,
thought, against Wolves on Saturday. Look, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. I think maybe I'm thinking of the glass a little half empty there.
mm,
But
mm.
no, you're right. I think that is an ideal and perfect example of just the fickle nature of how United managers in general are judged, and that's why it will only be once at the end of the season you can sit back and take a much fuller analysis of the whole thing that you can really make that decision. Yeah.
David, how big a call would it be for Sir Jim Ratcliffe and the INEOS group to get rid of Erik Ten Hag? And you're looking at people that focus on excellence, right? I mean, people have talked about the relevance of domestic cups, but the FA Cup is still pretty high in the priorities of many clubs in the Premier League. If they got rid of Ten Hag at this moment in time when United are having so much change, is that the right call? It's a big call.
Yeah, it's a massive call, and they've got a lot of them to make since they've come in at Old Trafford, and this process of evolution, revolution means there's going to be some massive decisions on the horizon or already being made. Many arrivals, many departures, but this feels like the biggest of them all and the most pressing. Therefore, it requires some mature and adult conversation. I think Critch has laid it out perfectly there. There's no decision yet, to our knowledge. But that doesn't explain the whole context. If you go back to when Erik Ten Hag came in, I remember reporting on it at the time. Manchester United were in a bit of a mess again, not for the first
Mm,
time since Sir Alex Ferguson left. And most of the supporters that I saw commenting on it or spoke to wanted Erik Ten Hag in. There was a bit of mystique around him, having come from Ajax previously in the youth setup at Bayern Munich and elsewhere. They seemed to favour him over the long-standing favourite, which had been Mauricio Pochettino. In that first season, he gets Champions League qualification, a cup in the bag, and another final. As Mark points out, it could be even better by the end of this season, and that's why judgment needs to be reserved. In between, there have been some high points, of course, and the results have not been disastrous by and large.
mm,
However, there have been low moments. And when you look at the Champions League exit and having no European football in this second half of the season, it's not acceptable by Manchester United standards. But each time there's a caveat. So, what about the defeat at Arsenal that Ten Hag keeps referencing, and Arsenal fans are taking much amusement from it? I was there. Garnacho being ruled onside would have ended that
mm,
game. And
mm,
there were many other moments across the course of the season. I think the one that really hurt him was probably Fulham, where there was no discernible sort of style of play or identity, tempo, spirit. It felt like the sort of performance that leads to a managerial exit. But there haven't been tons of those under Ten Hag. And he will point to the injuries, also the circumstances around the club. He's trying to manage in in a very, very difficult environment with the ownership changes and an enormous amount of fluctuation and undulation behind the scenes. I'm not sure how many managers could cope too well with that, and not many have been put in the position that he has. Also, it's a pretty rarefied environment, Manchester United, in terms of being able to face the scrutiny, the press, the media, the
mm,
speculation.
mm.
Mark describes it as one or two bad results and you're under the cosh. Like, how many managers wouldn't have been in this position? And you look at some of the players that are there, and there's a phrase trotted out that no manager would have been able to do much better with this crop, even a Pep Guardiola. Now, that's just subjective, and many of the signings were his, so we can't deny that. Enormous expenditure, not getting away from that, and mistakes have been made too. And therefore, INEOS coming in as new investors with sporting control, I think any new investors or ownership would consider a change of manager, head coach. I just think that's natural across the board. They often want their own person. And it's why, let's be sensible about this. They will be looking at options. One of those options is Ten Hag to stay on and continue. He's got a year left on his contract and an option to extend further. So perhaps they go forward with him. Perhaps they make a change. And therefore, it's only right and diligent that you are surveying the options on the market, who might fit your style, your vision, your group of people and players, who is available, who's not, what costs will be involved in Erik Ten Hag departing, somebody else arriving. What does Erik Ten Hag want to do? Because it seems like he will be part of conversations, maybe already is, about pre-season, about summer transfers, ins and outs. Like, there are so many different elements to this that means we can't come out with this sensational, he's going to go, he's going to stay. I do think the FA Cup's important, because if he manages to get past Coventry, have another final against City, who knows, perhaps another trophy on the horizon. Champions League qualification is massive for Manchester United, for their football side of things, and also for their finances, profitability and sustainability situation, their reputation, and so much more besides. So, and if he manages to bring them there, he's putting up a really strong argument to continue in this job. And so INEOS have a huge amount at stake here. And that's why they will be treading very carefully before coming to a conclusion. And you expect that decision, that conclusion will come in the summer. And yesterday just proved why it was probably unwise to have made a decision earlier, if they haven't. And it may be unwise to make a decision in the coming weeks because of moments like Coventry on the horizon.
Yeah, Critch, something David just said there I found really interesting, this idea of having a vision and implementing the vision. And, that comes with several permutations, right? Having the right kind of players, getting rid of previous players. I mean, he's had all that to deal with at this moment in time. I don't know many Manchester United managers of recent that have lasted more than, up to 3 full campaigns? I mean, to try and convey that vision as well, it's tricky, just considering the circumstances he's currently in at this moment in time.
Yeah, look, and I think that's been, like I said before, that I think that's been an accusation leveled at Ten Hag this season, that they haven't had that vision. They haven't had that defined, clear style of play. I think there has been. I think it was what we saw yesterday. I just think the way that United play is so chaotic and so back to front and so end to end that lends itself towards extreme results. And I think you've had some extreme results. Just take the Liverpool games. I mean, he's now beaten them in both times that he's played them at Old Trafford during his tenure. Obviously, they had the game at Anfield in December where it was goalless, but they were absolutely dominated in that. And then you also have the 7-0 at the end of last season. That is the kind of results that the way that United play lends itself towards. And yeah, also the circumstances. And look, I think an interesting thing is, you mentioned it there, time, right? So how much time did managers get? Do they only get a couple of seasons? Ten Hag's had 18 months now. I'm thinking back to the other managers who followed Ferguson, and they really, like you say, they didn't really get that much longer, right? If you think each of those managers, I'm thinking now, the popular perception around was that really they'd all reached their natural end, even though they didn't get perhaps as long as, obviously Ferguson, but not long enough to really implement the vision. There was a compelling reason for a change in each of those cases. And when you look at what happened after they changed, there was also a kind of short-term positive effect. Van Gaal came in and returned them to the Champions League. Mourinho came in, won 2 trophies and got them back to the Champions League. Ollie came in, reinvigorated the whole club. The one word that was associated, I'm sure David heard it as well, was toxic about Mourinho's reign towards the end. Ollie completely changed that and got 2 Champions League qualifications back to back before he left. So there was short-term benefits to making these changes and ultimately getting rid of the manager. But at the same time, we're sat here and we're talking about the post-Sir Alex Ferguson era as though it's like this one big grey homogenous blob of misery, and it kind of is, right? It kind of is compared to the rest of United's history. It is, and it hasn't been a good decade or so for United. So no matter how many times they've changed the manager, that hasn't changed. And really, I kind of think that's almost quite a compelling reason to stick with Ten Hag. You know, no manager has succeeded under this structure that's been in place for the last decade. But that structure is now changing. We're seeing INEOS go to work on it. We're seeing reform. So do you really need to change the manager at the same time? I think that is one of the stronger arguments against that, for actually keeping Ten Hag in place.
There's no guarantee, as with any managerial change, that somebody coming in, the names that you've seen linked, whether it be a De Zerbi, Potter, Southgate, and plenty more besides, that would do any better than Ten Hag. And so if you are going to make the change, you need to be utterly convinced that from everything you've been assessing, and don't forget that INEOS are conducting this sort of evaluation on the club, root and branch review of everything that's going on there. So they'll be looking at his training sessions, his conduct, his behaviour, the way he interacts with players and staff and executives, and they'll come to their conclusions. But if you are going to move him on and bring somebody else in, it's a big call to be absolutely adamant that this new person corrects all of those faults, perceived faults, and is going to work how you want him to in recruitment, in pre-season, and start getting the results with this same sky-high expectation and spectre that Ten Hag works under. And, you know, there are small elements that work in his favour. The Champions League places look pretty certain to be expanded for the Premier League. So they're on course to overtake Germany in the coefficient, which would see Italy and England take the 2 extra spots in the new format Champions League next season. And so Manchester United and their case is strengthened there. And Ten Hag would, I'm sure, argue that he deserves the chance to work with a fit group of players. But I don't think INEOS will just want to make change for change's sake. Mark touched upon it there. With everything that's going on there at the moment. And we're just talking about the football side here, but there'll be changes behind the scenes on the commercial, various different departments, the stadium project, which is going to be one of the biggest features of their time, no doubt, at Manchester United. And that seems to be gathering pace. You need an overwhelming reason to be dispensing with the manager amid all of that. Perhaps you continue him on his contracts, which is also financially beneficial to you as well. And you delay that decision while you continue to make these structural changes. You've got a sporting director coming in post gardening leave, chief executive coming in, technical director coming in, maybe others too. By the time they're all in, we'll quite possibly already be into next season. And those people need to help and contribute to the decision on something like the head coach manager. Maybe this is one for 2025 in their mind, or 2026. So that's why I don't think we should jump to conclusions. And you know, an end to the season that follows the tone anywhere near what was set yesterday. And let's not get too excited about this from a United perspective. They were a few chances to Liverpool away from being blown away in that second half, and it would have been a very different conversation. But the tone set yesterday, if they manage to capture that and galvanise and build upon it in these final weeks of the season, we might not even be asking this question come the summer.
I wonder, and I know we're sort of irking on the side that Ten Hag might stay, but football is an ever fickle world. I wonder if, you know, there could be an impact. You know, there's a lot of top clubs in Europe looking for a manager. There's a few managers now available that weren't available when Ten Hag took the job. Could that influence things at all, David?
So you're looking at the likes of Thomas Tuchel, for example. There's other experienced managers around, but I don't think, despite reports that Jose Mourinho would like to have another crack at it, that's a route Manchester United would be going down. And certainly with INEOS, if they make a change, the sort of feeling is that they want maybe somebody a bit younger who is suited to their structure and their style and who they know well and can collaborate with. I've got to be careful with the wording because I don't want it to be perceived as like a yes man, somebody that just does everything they want to say and it is a puppet to the regime and doesn't have the strength of determination, the courage of their convictions, like a Ten Hag or somebody that's dominant, a Pep Guardiola, a Carlo Ancelotti. But you're right, it is a fascinating time in the managerial market with movements galore. And, Liverpool are going to need a replacement for Jurgen Klopp. Is that going to be Xabi Alonso? Bayern Munich want him as well. Bayer Leverkusen want him to stay. Is Ancelotti going to stay at Real Madrid? You think so because he signed a new contract, but that's only worth the paper it's written on. Let's see how their season finishes. A couple of really impressive managers doing their work in Italy, like Thiago Motta. You've got Hansi Flick, an experienced option who's ready and available. A number of slots looking to be filled. If there are disastrous ends to the season elsewhere, there could yet be changes that we're not talking about. People keep an eye on Chelsea, but it looks like they're quite settled for now. We're not a million miles away from needing to know what's going to happen at Manchester City with Pep Guardiola. He's under contract until 2025. Don't forget that change is coming at some point at that club. Will Roberto De Zerbi stay at Brighton and Hove Albion? Barcelona have a vacancy coming up, which puts Xavi in the mix. We think for once PSG are stable under Luis Enrique, but he is building his reputation further. He has interviewed for some of the jobs in the Premier League. And then even the rung, I don't want to say it with disrespect, but below it, there's movement. You see Ralph Hasenhüttl still go into Wolfsburg. The manager at Lens, who's built a very strong reputation, is being looked at by many of these clubs. So it's a time where they will be, sharply focused on the fact that it could be the right moment to take the person you think is right for you if they are available and there's no compensation, and you take advantage of that market. And the top leaders make the hardest decisions and often calls that you might not be expecting or aren't that popular. They do it because they know it's the right time. And we don't know if that right time is going to be this summer. Perhaps others will be available in 2025, and their executives already know that now. So that is a really fascinating one for INEOS. You got Michel doing so well at Girona. Everywhere you look, there are people starting to stake their claim. But I just don't know how they will view that. I don't know if this is the right time in their eyes. But clearly, the managerial market is a massive consideration for a hierarchy like this, because you just simply don't want to miss the boat when somebody who is perceived to be the right man, the next big thing, because these people know much more than us. They're surveying these things, they're running the data. You've got high performing coaches. We've talked about it with Liverpool. Somebody like Eddie Howe does really well on the numbers, and people are looking at Newcastle and saying, "Oh, is there a bit of uncertainty there?" You've got Farioli at Nice, who's done very well, and obviously that's an INEOS own club. That's why these people like your Omar Baradas, your Dan Ashworths, Jean-Claude Blanc on behalf of INEOS, they're sort of coming into these high power positions. They're paid the big bucks because they've got to make calls that are going to define the future of Manchester United. And one thing I would just say in and amongst that conversation is that if Erik Ten Hag was on the market, there would be many clubs looking at him. There probably already are because of the uncertainty around him. We've seen links to Germany, some of the biggest clubs there, for example. And perhaps if Manchester United didn't have a manager, they would be looking to somebody like him. And so at times, to have is to hold, and they might decide that he is the best candidate to lead them forward. And that, the fact that they have a bit of stability already by having somebody in position is something that Liverpool don't have, for example, and maybe that is something to harness.
Yeah, Critch, I wonder if there is the right candidate out there, especially for Manchester United, because this job it's quite a special job, isn't it? We talk about the work Jurgen Klopp's done at Liverpool, connecting the board, connecting the team, connecting the city. Pep's done very similar, with Manchester City. But actually, from a United standpoint, give credit to the work Erik Ten Hag's done, right? United are known for bringing youth forward. Look at Mainu, look at the likes of Garnacho, developing well under this new manager. I mean, you could also make an argument and say, actually, he's the guy that seems to fit right now.
I think David makes a great point about how if Erik Ten Hag was on the market, then you'd
Yeah.
be looking at him, which sums up
Yeah.
almost the crazy and ridiculous nature of of football. I don't know, of top flight European football. Look, the point about youngsters is a really good one, and I think it's one that Ten Hag hasn't really received enough credit for. Taking a chance on Kobbie Mainoo when he did, he was ready to play him at the start of the season if he didn't get injured in pre-season. There was absolutely no expectation, no chance of him leaving on loan to go and get some more regular minutes to try and toughen himself up. There was none of that. Ten Hag had faith of him from really the back end of last season, and look, it can only be justified in that. So that's to his credit. Garnacho, promoting him into the team, making him a regular starter this season. He's in line to be United's Player of the Year, I think, along with perhaps Diogo Dallo. There's not many other candidates, let's face it, but he's been brilliant. You're right, that's something in Ten Hag's favour. He's tapping into elements and traditions of the club that people would have wanted him to. That if he'd said in his interview process, "This is what I want to do," they would have felt the decision makers would have said, "That sounds great, let's do that." So I think there's a lot of things in his credit and in his favour. Look, let's not pretend like we weren't here 2 weeks ago after the derby saying what's going to happen. Could he? There was a lot of people. Some people were asking for him to go immediately. It was never going to happen, but there's an argument there at least. If he's not the guy for the long term, why is he going to see out the rest of the season? I think that was a genuine argument that people were making 2 weeks ago. So you can't be too knee jerk about these things, and INEOS won't be for all the reasons that David's outlined. People will naturally kind of play dot to dot and draw connections between Dan Ashworth and Graham Potter and Roberto De Zerbi by the same token because of the Brighton connection. Look, I think what we know is that INEOS will want somebody who's comfortable working within a structure, within a more of a head coach role than a manager role. That's how they see it. That's how they've operated at other clubs. I think, as we've kind of touched upon already, there's an open question over Ten Hag. Is he the guy for that system? Is he the guy for that structure? He's had a lot of authority at United, probably more than he ever expected to have, and sometimes that's been more out of necessity than anything else. But he'd be happy with a little less power. It's kind of that decision's on him as well. So there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of moving things at play. I think this idea that you can't really plan a succession like this, I think is key. Top managers don't leave one club to join another. Very, very rarely happens. It's about who's available. It's about who's on the market at the right time. It's about circumstances. There's no better example than that, I think, than Liverpool, actually. Hiring Klopp 8 years ago. He was such an obvious move. He was the ideal. Look, everything about him screams Liverpool, and he's only proven that over the years. But if they hadn't moved at that precise moment to get him, maybe he would have gone to another top club. If they get that wrong, the last 8 years of English football look very different, right? So it's about timing. It's about all these different factors coming into play. There's a decision to be made, whether it's to stick with Ten Hag or make a change. But you can be sure that INEOS are going to deliberate over that and are going to be very thorough in that decision. And maybe you haven't always been able to say that about United in the past, and that can only help in the hope that it's the right decision when it finally comes.
And it's also about money, because Manchester United are in a very tight spot in terms of profitability and sustainability. We've heard and reported all about that. And they're trying to maximize their budget for summer recruitment. If you do dispense with Ten Hag, that's going to cost you a lot of money and his staff. If you bring somebody in, say your chosen candidate is Ruben Amorim, he's got a 10 million euros release clause now. That's come down from something like in the 20s, I think, when Chelsea spoke to him on a couple of occasions a year or so ago. But there will be people in jobs who are going to cost you. And so I do think that is a very serious consideration for some of these clubs who are going to see that cost go against their profitability and sustainability balance sheet. So we can say, just go and get so-and-so from this club, but think about the outgoing impact of that on the bank balance and think about the incoming too. And that is something that INEOS will have to ponder among all of the other factors that we've laid out.
Yeah, for sure. Do you know what? I think this is probably the first pod we've done this season where there's semi-positive news for Manchester United fans. Oh, goodness me. Yeah, the season's almost over. We finally got there. Anyway, gents, thanks so much for your time, man. David, Mark, and don't forget to rate and review the podcast. We will be back tomorrow, of course, for another episode of the Athletic FC podcast. Thanks for listening.